I think we're trying to solve a software problem with hardware. Right now, for many companies, the software is glitching. We have burnout, we have disconnection, we have fragmentation. If you're to mandate any approach, whether that be return to the office or something else, you're attempting to fix that glitch by rebooting the hardware. But if the code is bad, the building's not going to fix it.
Welcome to Design Nerds Anonymous, the podcast that sparks curiosity at the intersection of business and design. I'm your host, Amanda Schneider, founder and president at ThinkLab, speaker on TED.com, and now officially a published author. My new book, Work for What's Next, published by Wiley, is coming into the world. And this season of the podcast is built around the ideas inside it. Each episode brings you into a deeper conversation with leaders who aren't just reacting to how work is changing. They're actively shaping what comes next. Today's guest is exactly that kind of leader. Deb Golden is Deloitte's U.S. Chief Innovation Officer. For nearly 3 decades, she's worked at the intersection of technology, risk, and human potential, helping some of the world's largest organizations navigate disruption before it becomes crisis. Her work has been featured everywhere, from the Wall Street Journal and Harvard Business Review to The Economist, Fast Company, and even the World Economic Forum. But what makes Deb's perspective different isn't just her resume, it's how she thinks. Deb has the rare ability to see patterns before most people feel the pain, and to name the systems that quietly stop organizations from evolving. I'm so proud to say that Deb also wrote the foreword to Work for What's Next, because her work and her leadership philosophy sit at the very heart of this book. It's all about trust, unlearning old rules, and what it actually takes to lead in a world where steady state is gone for good. All right, here's my conversation with Deb Golden. So excited to have you here and put you in front of my loyal listeners, my fellow design nerds. So I would love it if you could start out. You sit at the intersection of people, technology, and transformation every day. So for our listeners who maybe don't know you yet, could you introduce yourself, maybe a little about your role, your work, and the kinds of innovation challenges that you help solve at Deloitte?
Absolutely. And first and foremost, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm super excited to talk about this. Your book is fascinating and amazing, and I'm really glad that we're able to uncover so much of it here also today. So, just a little bit about me. I've spent the last 30 years operating, as you mentioned, at the intersection of, I would say, risk, innovation, technology, but maybe most importantly, human potential. And so when I think about that, it's actually gone across federal government to the Fortune 100. But when you think about the types of work, it's really about seeing the patterns in the market before they become problems. And if we think about that, most people are very reactive to the problem in the balance sheet. I really spend most of my days helping massive organizations build that connected tissue needed to survive, particularly when we start to talk about technology and technology disruption. And I honestly feel like I'm so valued to be able to have gone through so many different kind of avenues, and whether, like I said, that's traversing our global environment, our government environment, our commercial environment, having the ability to really learn from people, I would say has been a constant. And if you didn't look at my LinkedIn, one thing that you may not see when looking at a paper resume is, as you know, but for the audience, I am a longtime, puppy raiser, and I love to do that for service dogs, particularly as it relates to veterans and first responders. And where that connection is, and I'm going to bring it around real quickly. And again, it may sound like a hobby to many people, but it's actually the foundation of my leadership philosophy. When I think about what it means to raise a service dog, it really is a masterclass in influence over control. You can't command a living system into resilience, right? You have to build a bond that's so strong, whether that's a system, whether that's a dog or an organization, that makes the right decision even when you're not holding the leash. And so for me, that's kind of the lens that I bring into the business, whether that's, again, the technology side, the innovation side, the risk side, but it's designing those systems that are secure enough to be safe, but brave enough to innovate. And I just am not sure that we're entirely there yet as a society.
I've been so fascinated by your puppy raising initiatives. Will you tell our listeners where they can find out more information about this puppy raising? Because I've had so much fun following your Instagram.
I support and work with a group called America's Vet Dogs and the Guide Dog Foundation. And you can find out all about them both on LinkedIn, Instagram, the website. There are many organizations that help service dogs find their forever home, and that could be serving a veteran or a first responder. The reason I like to work with America's Vet Dogs and the Guide Dog Foundation, everything that goes into being a puppy raiser, we enable someone's life to be better, greater for independence. And they do it at free of cost. But like I said, I have learned more from my puppy raising experiences than I candidly could ever learn from just sitting behind the desk.
Obviously, it comes down to trust, whether we're talking about raising puppies or, as you said, kind of figuring out this collaborative culture. So I want to transition this trust idea to the book because it's really where the book begins. We talk about something that we call the trust gap. And I think one thing that makes our approach to this generational research different is that we don't start with generational stereotypes or what this generation wants that makes someone else feel like they have to give something up so that the younger generations get what they want. We start with business challenges. And so when I look at what I'm hearing from our audiences about challenges they're having, it's really around creating culture in a hybrid world. When we ask thousands of workers across generations, what's the hardest part about working in a hybrid world? One of our most interesting findings is that twice as many Gen Zers said that trust or a growing trust gap was the big issue when compared to baby boomers. So Deb, from your vantage point inside all of these incredible organizations that you work with, do you see this trust gap going? Why do you think this trust gap is growing? And maybe if you've seen anything or heard about anything that helps close it, I'd love to hear about that.
I think we're seeing a gap because what I'll call the architecture of trust has fundamentally changed. And candidly, I don't think we're even remotely finished with the renovation yet. I think when we think about what corporate trust means, for a long time, corporate trust was environmental, right? It relied on the osmosis, the hallway, the conversations, the open door, the physicality of being visible at work. It was built on proximity. But when we move to hybrid models, and by the way, that doesn't just mean our physical sense moving to hybrid, that means the technology and the systems also moved outside of a corporate office, if you will. We removed that physical scaffolding, but we didn't replace it with digital equivalents. And what I think we're seeing from generation changes is not that, one is better or worse, but at the end of the day, Gen Z isn't asking for more trust than, say, the boomers, but they're asking for structural transparency. And I think it's a very interesting way to look at this concept of trust because I've heard people talk about it and say somebody wants more than somebody else or less. I think it's just a matter of difference of how we look at this structural transparency. And again, if you go back to thinking about the physical cues of the office, everybody was historically operating even in a vacuum. When we built systems, 70s, 80s, 90s, we built the system based around four walls and everything of that system operated within that wall. And so when I think about the organizations that are closing the gap, those are the ones that are treating trust as a design challenge. They're replacing accidental proximity with intentional visibility. So designing clear, repeatable rhythms of communication that allow people to feel secure without needing to be in the same room. And if they are in the same room, how do you actually make that much more purposeful so that when you gain that trust, it's based on sight to trust, inclusive of the signal? Because we have so much noise in today's day and age, it's really important to be able to discern the signal from the noise.
I wholly agree. And one of our previous podcast episodes was titled "The Future of Work Will Be About the Entanglement of HR, IT, and Workplace Design." And I think when you talk about some of those silos, it goes even to the business functions that haven't fully integrated and certainly haven't transitioned for what I'll call a digital first world. Because I would argue, even if you're back in the office 5 days a week, this globalization effect is a real thing, and you're likely collaborating with other offices.
The visual in my head is like we changed the model of how we're working, and yet office structures have not changed. Like physical office structures haven't changed. And so even in its most basic sense, if we haven't actually changed the physical structure, how are we enabling our people to do the very things that you're talking about? And I would take it a step further. As you mentioned, The hard work really is in redesigning, or I would even say reimagining these systems, because a lot of what I've seen is that companies are trying to address the systems of HR or IT, but they're doing it with the frame of what they knew about yesterday versus the frame of what they need to reimagine for tomorrow. And I do think that that's critical if we're going to look at quote unquote redesign. We really allow ourselves to reimagine what that connectivity, quote unquote, needs to look like.
I love that you talk about reimagining that. It was actually one of the most impactful lessons from the MBA program that I was in, is they said, you can't improve what you can't measure. Let's go back to your innovation work and kind of tie that to this concept of old and new rules. What are some of the outdated rules that you still see companies clinging to? And why do you see them so incompatible with how work is happening now?
I'll probably pick on two. And one is this old rule of the idea of the container. And we designed many organizations for the world where boundaries were solid. Employees were inside, the market was outside, the value was created within the walls. Today, value is created in a broad set ecosystem. The teams extend far beyond a single payroll. They could be gig workers, they could be AI agents, they could be partners, they could be clients, they could even be competitors. And as we think about that, all of those individuals are co-creating in real time. And if you try to run a quote unquote networked reality with a contained mindset, you're going to create friction and you're not going to get the highest amount of value that you could possibly get. So for me, the first kind of old rule is, don't build with inside the container. And again, the container isn't just the physical organization, it's how you look at a truly bound ecosystem to create the most amount of value, regardless of whether that's inside or outside the walls. I mean, that would be one. The second one I might add on to that is unlearning. And, I love to use the word unlearning, but unlearning that standardization equals fairness. In the past, we treated everyone the same to be fair. And I think in a complex, high performance environment, standardization actually becomes a vulnerability. And so if we think about unlocking true human potential right now, we have to move towards mass personalization. How do we build systems that are flexible enough to support different working styles, life stages, cognitive approaches? The goal isn't to force everyone into the same template. It's to design a platform where different types of talent can plug and perform. And I just think historically, the old rule, if you will, back to your question, is that, again, standardization equals fairness. And I think with the advent, obviously, of AI, we can democratize things like innovation. We need to do the hard work of recreating systems, again, reimagining systems that are flexible enough to support all these types of thinking, being, doing, if we truly want to evolve where we are and really solve some of the world's most complex challenges.
I love that you brought up unlearning. You're going to read about it to all of our listeners. You're going to read about it in the forward of the book. But Deb's whole TEDx talk was all about rethinking and unlearning. And she didn't just talk about it, she really modeled it from the stage. So I'll leave you with that piece of curiosity if you haven't checked out her talk.
As the home of NeoCon for decades, the MART was built on the power of physical presence. You came to Chicago, you walked the floors, you experienced it in person. That foundation still matters, perhaps now more than ever. But we've also taken to heart the reality that how people engage has changed. ThinkLab's data shows that one of the things professionals value most at NeoCon is CEU education. Today, many more designers are accessing that content through our digital platform, dramatically expanding reach while strengthening the in-person experience. That shift wasn't about replacing what worked. It was about building upon it. We believe that leadership in this industry means the willingness to rethink, to evolve, and to serve our communities in new ways. For NeoCon 2026, we've introduced several new product offerings, including Illuminated NeoCon, a show within a show featuring design-focused architectural and decorative lighting, and the NeoCon Collab, a curated, multi-brand environment that will create an elevated, inspirational experience in our 7th floor exhibit hall. And we're proud to continue shaping what's next, together.
going back to kind of your first rule that you called out too, I think one of the pieces we have to rethink and unlearn is that work is synonymous with place, that work is a noun. Today, work is a verb. There's still a workplace that is a noun. And I think that mistakenly, some people say by focusing on people and process first, that the physical environment is less important. And I would argue that ironically, as we're freed up from a set work location, it requires more design work, more of a physical space to make people want to come to it. On that front, do you think that this is making a sense of place more important or less important as we really try to figure out this digital first world?
Everybody thinks and learns and interacts differently. I wish I could say, everybody would be more productive in this way or everybody else would think better. But as we all know, it's like, where's your best idea come from? It's not usually because you've spent hundreds of hours building a 3-year strategy, tied to something. It's because you've allowed your brain to walk around in different capacities. And that could be walking around by getting feedback from others in an office. It could be taking a minute to do a walking meeting outside the office. There's so many different ways that people think and interact and can really just get that tenacity about how to go and build something for tomorrow. And I think what it ultimately comes down to is signal fidelity, right? We have so much noise again happening. The clarity that any asset has or that any leader has is the fact that they can be clear. There's so much noise. There's so many things going on. What is a priority? And if you can actually become more clear so that it's not noise to the individual. What do you expect when you're in the office? Is it just simply to show up to show up? That's probably not getting you the outcome that you want to get. Or if somebody's in the office, what is it that you want to be able to achieve from that? So that when people hear noise, they can either discern the signal or they don't hesitate. And so for me, I think you need to balance that with understanding not just clarity on the destination, but autonomy on the route. So many people just don't do things, and it's inherent in our human nature. We want people to have different ways of achieving the final answer. I mean, it's how we're going to innovate the most. We don't want groupthink. We want people to be able to understand what the North Star is. The why and the what, we should absolutely enable and engage with what I'll call proactive debate, right? That is how we play to everyone's strengths. So I don't think it's or will it be completely physical or will it be completely digital as we think about the world tomorrow? I absolutely think it's but I think having that sense of clarity and the autonomy to discern the route is going to be what gives people the confidence to move with velocity because they know actually where they're headed.
I love that. And I think a line from the book is clarity is kind, but it's not only kind, it's contagious. When I was preparing for my TEDx talk, I had a line in my talk. It's still in there, but it changed a little bit. It was something like the future of work starts being with people being clear about when and where they work best. And this came up from actually some Future Forum research that says more people care about when they work than where they work. But as I was practicing and making my poor best friend Beth listen in to this thing over and over, she said, Amanda, because of the work you do, you have thought about this so much, but honestly, I've never thought about that before. Work is just somewhere I went from 8 to 5 because that's what you do. You get a job, you get a key card, and that's just the way it is. So one of the challenges I put forth in the book is really challenging the individual to think about when and where they work best. And I have some exercises to walk that individual through on their own. But on the contrary, I'll say that that can feel quite scary for large organizations because you can't possibly, if you've got 400 employees, accommodate 400 different ways of working. However, without that clarity, our design and architecture audience can't design better spaces if we don't know what better means. So how do you think organizations should balance maybe that individual clarity with those company priorities?
I think we're trying to solve a software problem with hardware. If you think about the physical office as the hardware, the culture that typically supports companies, organizations, the rituals, the connection, the behaviors is the software. Right now, for many companies, the software is glitching, right? We have burnout, we have disconnection, we have fragmentation. If you're to mandate any approach, whether that be return to the office or something else, you're attempting to fix that glitch by rebooting the hardware. But if the code is bad, the building's not going to fix it. And so when I think about the opportunity back to my, whether it be unlearning or reimagining, we need to reimagine the purpose of convergence. Why were we together? And what is the value of together, right? today, particularly in an AI forward world, we don't need the office necessarily for what I'll call production. We can produce from anywhere. What we need the office for is collision, right? We need it to create positive friction that creates sparks, right? The unplanned interactions, the celebrations, the complex problem solving. And I think when we design spaces specifically for high value human collision, the office stops being a mandate and starts to become a magnet. And we need to make the commute worthy of the human investment. And I think if we do that, people will start to realize why they're being pulled in with that magnetic force, not just because they're told to show up from 9 to 5. They're there because they want that friction and they appreciate the value of the spark that it creates.
I love that you use the word collision. Collaboration is so overused. It's like we forgot what it even means. As we think about this idea of collisions, I've heard things like ROC, return on commute. I've heard ROI, credit to Gensler, who shared this one at one of our Think Lab events, which is return on interaction, really looking at what people are looking for from the office. And I love all these fresh takes. If you listen to the media and hear what people are saying about this office movement, we're still in the middle of this RTO movement. And one of the things I challenge in the book is this RTO movement is trying to fix a how problem with a where solution. So in your view, what are companies getting wrong about the relationship between space, culture, and behavior? And what do you think it could look like if they maybe start to reframe the challenge correctly?
I think the wrong is probably associated with the fact that they aren't looking at the intersectionality of the very things you just talked about, right? They're looking at if people are back in the office, I should be more productive. Like you can't just mandate that. I guess you could mandate that. And we've seen what the results are for that. And they're varied, right? They're varied. And I actually think it goes back to what is the purpose? So in the type of organization you're running, maybe being in the office matters because you're actually building widgets. If you're building a physical widget and you've got throughput that you have to have in the office, then being together matters in a very different way than, say, if you're doing something that everyone can be remote and should be remote. But I think part of the complexity that's missing is that connectivity to the last piece, which is around not just human connection, but human intelligence. And again, I still go back to everyone works very differently. I hear from people all the time. They're like, Deb, virtual for us is isolating. Like we don't feel like we're getting our voices heard. We don't understand how to work in a disruptive virtual environment because it feels isolating to me. Even in those situations when you tell someone, well, go back in the office, that'll automatically fix it. Again, if you don't fix the underlying challenges, the HR side, the talent side, that's not going to automatically fix it just because you're in proximity with one another. So again, I go back to understanding that what works for one doesn't work for the other. And the people that, again, I'm seeing get it right are doing the hard work to change the underlying systems so that, by the way, it's not just about how you operate, is the performance management and the talent system matching that, right? So a lot of people today would say if they're not in the office, they're going to get a lower evaluation because they're not seen. And I would argue then that's valuing the wrong thing. It's valuing whether you're quote unquote seen, not actually whether you're providing value to the problem, the situation, the organization, whether you were being physically seen in the office or virtually seen outside the office.
We've talked about that. I know you've shared this as well. The idea of shifting from the golden rule to the platinum rule, right? Like I think that we were all raised on the golden rule, which is treat others the way you want to be treated. But back to your unlearning that equal is fair, really looking at how do we not treat the others the way we want to be treated, because that may not be a great experience for someone else, especially with these younger digital first generations that are used to much more customization. How do we treat them the way they want to be treated? And we can't build systems that we don't understand. We can't respond to mindsets by guessing. And so one of the other challenges in the book is really looking to set up systems for success. I share in my TED Talk and in the book the example of the Gucci shadow board, along with many, many more in the book, that are ways to bring these new perspectives and voices to the table in a way that honors them, but doesn't put them fully in the driver's seat. And I think this is an important concept from the book too. Anytime we say generations, I think some of the older generations prickle because it feels like they have to give something up in order for these younger generations to get what they want, quote unquote. But as we explored a lot of this throughout the book, I will say, I believe that naming it by generations and acknowledging these differences helps us see the differences for what they are, but also try to get to a common solution that makes sense.
Hello, this is Cindy Kaufman. I am the Vice President of Marketing and Design Solutions for Mannington Commercial. Mannington Commercial is a proud sponsor of this season of Design Nerds Anonymous. And as someone who's had the privilege of reading Work for What's Next early on and even being quoted in it, I can tell you the shifts Amanda writes about are real. B2B selling has changed. Our clients are more informed, but decision-making is more complex, timelines are tighter, and loyalty is earned. At Mannington Commercial, we take that seriously. We've invested in equipping our teams differently, not just with product knowledge, but with context, with better digital tools, with a deeper understanding of the pressures our design partners are navigating every single day. Because beautiful flooring isn't enough. How we show up matters just as much. We believe the future of our industry belongs to brands that listen harder, prepare better, and make our partners' jobs easier. If you haven't connected with a Mannington rep recently, I'd like to invite you to, not just to see what's new, but to experience how we're thinking about what's next.
The Bleacher Report app is your destination for sports. Right now, the NBA is heating up, March Madness is here, and MLB is almost back. Every day there's a new headline, a new highlight, a new moment you've got to see for yourself. That's why I stay locked in with the Bleacher Report app. For me, it's about staying connected to my sports. I can follow the teams I care about, get real-time scores, breaking news, and highlights all in one place. Download the Bleacher Report app today so you never miss a moment.
So, as we think about these systems for success and trying to build systems that help us hear voices that maybe are not always invited to the table, who are these unexpected voices that organizations often overlook? And maybe outside of a shadow board, are there other systems that you've seen be effective to help us hear them without just giving up control to say, okay, Gen Z, take the reins, run my company?
2 points there, and then I'll kind of get into an example of something I think is that any generations help us understand human behavior and trends, and there are always things that we should take from all of people, right? So whether it's one generation or another, whether it's a location in terms of geography, whether it's typical and atypical types of thinking, like there's all kinds of different things that could put people into quote unquote groups. I think the important thing is to be able to identify diverse sets of thinking and speaking. And it's interesting to me because we've had these types of people that have been in organizations forever, regardless of your generation. And so when I think about the things, though, that we can learn, because more and more of the generations coming in front of us, because they are digital native, are just bred to think differently, resolve differently, act differently. And I think it's a lot of things that are happening around us. But what we know to be true is that innovation lies at the edges, not at the center. And I think when you think about traditional corporate structures, they're designed to smooth out the edges. They're not designed for that friction at the edge. You know, we hear it all the time. We talk about things like groupthink. There's comments that are made inside the boardroom where there's physiological studies that have been done that show that in boardrooms, there's common heartbeat, there's common breathing, which again means to me that you've built groupthink into these structures where these are the very structures that don't and shouldn't have groupthink. And so we tend to filter out the voices that cause friction, the skeptics, the people who ask why one too many times, or the people who simply process information differently than the standard, if you will. And I think that that friction is what's most valuable. And so for me, that is the first signal that a pattern is breaking. And patterns were meant to be broken, by the way, in my opinion. Patterns were not meant to always stay the same. You know, I call it this thing called intelligent disobedience, right? We give people the permission to challenge the process. Somewhere along the way, we've lost the art of debate. And so if the process is no longer serving the outcome, we need to harness that. We need to sense mechanisms. We need to have those different voices that see the edge. They're the ones who see the quiet signals. The challenge, again, is that the culture historically does not allow that to flourish. And so effective systems don't just broadcast from the top down. They have deep listening built into the architecture to capture those signals from the edge. And again, I think back to the other point I made a minute ago, it's not just about capturing the signal. I'm a firm believer we're not short of ideas. We probably have too many ideas. We're short of being able to take those ideas and literally go against the grain of the quote unquote system. That could be organization, people, process, tech. That's what change is, right? Change is about reimagining, not just for operational efficiency, which is the world that we're in today. It's, do we even need this process at all? And if you have too much groupthink, you're not going to have anyone be able to think about the edges in a way that is actually permissible to challenge the very process that people are sitting on.
So you've been deep in this journey of writing with me. I guess before I ask you our closing question, what haven't we talked about that you're like, wow, this is a really important thing that you want your audience to hear, that you think others might need to hear as we launch this book?
I'm going to tee off of what you just said, because I believe in it, everything that you have in the book. But the one thing just to take home, it is hard. That doesn't make it not something we should do. The hard work is in changing the system and having almost the radical audacity to want to change it. I mean, I think we have just, so many people have gotten stuck in the status quo because it's easy. And we're the people who design those systems. We also have the ability to ask questions to change those same very systems. And so I do think that while hard and typically an uphill battle, and I once had one of my fellow senior executives look at me and say to me, literally, Deb, you've made all this change and made all this progress for many different things. Did you expect someone to be at the top of the hill clapping for you? And I was like, as a matter of fact, I did. Like, it was a lot of hard work and often underappreciated and often perhaps by yourself. By the way, you don't need everyone to also live at the edge. Maybe it's a small portion of the organization, but the ability to embrace that group that is most times doing things that are not just difficult, but underappreciated, challenging, uphill, everybody coming up with every reason why it won't work, is not giving up on the hope that the hard work will actually cause the value that you want to see in the outcome. And I just think it's super important because, it's not to say that there aren't times that I've said, gosh, would it be easier just to give up? But knowing the value that you can get with the hard work just, I think, pays dividends. And particularly, again, in this day and age of AI, where we have the ability to have democratized innovation, there's so many voices that want to speak up and can speak up, but perhaps are diminished by the systems around them.
That's one reason your puppy raising has been so impactful to me as I've heard your stories, because I know you started out with everything these dogs have taught you about your leadership journey and what you do individually on a daily basis. But one other thing that I've heard from you is not only how you raise the puppies, but also how you advocate for the veterans and the systems around them. There was a story you told me about a certain organization that denied you entrance with your dog that was in training to a certain car, and how you went to the head of that organization and actually got their policy changed. And I relate that to this book in that, we're giving a lot of cues for individuals. But what I hope here is, like you and your dogs, we're not just training the dogs, we're also advocating for the systems that allow these veterans to thrive with their dog. You didn't just train a dog, you also advocated, because if it was a veteran that had that experience with that dog in that car that was being denied service, that veteran may have never left his house again. But because you advocated for overall policy and system change, hopefully that veteran that's already struggling with enough individually doesn't have to combat the system.
Yeah, and I would say it's happened in multiple modes of transportation. So whether that's planes, trains, or automobiles, the challenge is real. And again, I say this for those of you who may not know. I mean, puppy raising is, I get a puppy from 8 weeks old till about 13, 14, 15 months old, and they learn a large number of commands. And I can simply look at it like it's just training a dog. I understand a lot about public policy. I understand a lot about what individual corporate policy are associated with them, because we have individuals who've been fighting for a freedom that can't believe I can give them something back to help them live a more independent life so that I'm not on the literal battlefields. Then that's a benefit, not just for me, but coming from a veteran family as well, being able to give back is super important to me. And so when I 1/100th of a minute to get to be able to live in their shoes by being in public transportation or doing those things. It's important not just to understand the situation I'm in, but more importantly, to your point, if someone's struggling with something, how do they react in that situation? And I do think a lot of it comes down to education and awareness. Individuals might not know that. And so in these particular instances, I was treated very, very poorly, predominantly because I had a dog. The unfortunate thing is that the individual was not trained in understanding what does it mean to be a service dog? What does it mean to have a service dog, and or what should be the etiquette? Again, I would go back to human etiquette is just simply not to treat a human when you don't know the situation. But they did. And, given the fact that I knew that that wasn't just happening to me, it was happening to many other people, that I wanted to go and see what I could do to help change policy in that particular instance. And I'm proud to say that other people listened and we had the ability to change policy so that hopefully individuals don't go through that same situation, because, it does take a lot when any human is suffering from, again, whether that's anxiety, whether that's PTSD. It takes a lot to move and get out of the office and or out of the home or to do something that's different than your normal schedule. And if that's the case, why would you want to be treated, or why should you be treated so incredibly poorly? And I think what set me off on that direction was when I initially complained about the service, I basically was just given a refund. What is the typical process? There was probably a checklist that says when somebody complains, what do? We give them back their money. And my thinking at that time was, well, that's not going to change. It's not going to give them the education and awareness that they need. So that the next time an individual comes into that mode of transportation with their service animal, they're not treated the same way I was. And so that was what I ultimately was fighting for. I wish I could say that that was the only situation. I've been in that situation a number of times. I learned that empathy of people goes an incredibly long way. I get that I'm afforded an opportunity to use my voice. And I also understand that having a voice is super important to be able to just even hear and listen, see, feel, touch. We need to be able to adopt that so that we can go about changing the way that the old way worked, because candidly, it probably didn't even work before. We were just so used to it. And that's why I do what I do, is because I think there are ways to make the world better, and we should never stop trying to make the world better.
Wholly agree. And I think approaching that with humility and vulnerability and curiosity is probably the way to go. And it's, again, what I love about this book is hopefully an opportunity to advocate for what I needed when I was their age, because some of these things haven't changed. And there's a great exchange in the book where I got an irate text from a Gen X friend who was reading the book and was talking about Gen Z and their entitlement and how frustrated she was. And her feelings were valid. It was true. Everything she said was true in the situation that she was sharing about this Gen Zer. But she did end the text with, by the time I calm down and get past all of the anger, what this person was really asking for is not all that different than what I wanted at their age, what I want now in terms of work-life balance, in terms of, fairness and things like that. So I think that is my challenge for any of our listeners who decide to read the book is don't be offended, because it may rub the way you've thought before a little bit different, and it may activate some feelings that you have that are uncomfortable. But I hope that you push through it and help me kind of create what's next for the next generation. So with that in mind, Deb, I want to ask you in closing, if you had to choose one word to describe the future of work and what the leaders who succeed in that future understand that others might overlook.
My word would be adaptive. And I want to distinguish one thing there, because adaptive typically means reactive. Reactive is about survival. Adaptive is about learning/unlearning, right? The leaders that define the next error understand that steady state is never coming back. It isn't. And we are in a period of permanent flux, and that's okay. Again, I thrive in chaos, and I thrive in whether it's organized or unorganized. But even when we think about, again, the world of AI, it is a unpredictable learning model. So even the models that we're creating for technology, they're not in a constant state of steady. It is a constant state of fluctuation. And so when we think about that, the competitive advantage belongs to anybody who has a high metabolism for change. It's funny when I think about the way that we talk about change. Change is always, that is the constant. We know that. But the ones that can ingest new information, unlearn old habits, pivot without breaking their core identity, those will be the ones that rise to the top. And to me, core identity is very important. And so you're not moving from building moments, you're really building movements. And anybody, I go back to anybody can build a movement, but that requires a completely different type of leadership. And I love your word on whether that's vulnerability, whether that's humility, whether that's humbleness. We're all born with an ego. There's a positive ego, and then there becomes a negative ego. Use the moments that you have to truly create those movements. Because again, like I said, we're all talking about systems that were designed. They can be undesigned. They can be redesigned. It just takes humanity to figure out what needs to be done by unlocking that unlearning concept, because otherwise we're just going to keep building and rebuilding things from the past that are no longer going to serve us. And so my word as adaptive is not as reactive, but truly about learning and unlearning.
I love that. And one of the questions you asked me as you were writing was, what is one rule that you're struggling, Amanda, like that you write about, that you're struggling to unlearn yourself? And I will say a lot of these I'm struggling because I was raised, I'm over 25 years in my career. And there's a lot of the rules that we talk about in the book that I will humbly say I'm struggling myself to unlearn.
Kudos to you for attempting. And I think that's also really important. It isn't about the finish line. The finish line is going to be new every single second of every moment. Again, to your point, an old rule is like, make it to the finish line. What if the finish line was step one? And if we reframe how we think about the problem, then maybe we're not always racing to figure out what complete looks like. Instead, we're actually focused on the problem at hand, on how to redesign what we're living in the moment. And that's really hard to do in a world that runs 180 miles an hour. I know we talk about this often. It's constantly running. It's always on. There's so many different demands of your time. But maybe, again, reframe. It's not the finish line. Maybe it is truly the starting point, and that every decision that you make can truly be your choose your own adventure and change that for everybody else around you.
Love it. Well, we knew this time would go fast, but Deb, thank you so much for spending time with me today.
And thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure. I really do appreciate it. And I'm going to keep reading the book over and over again. So I appreciate all that you're doing.
We're so appreciative that Deb took the time to spend with us and share her incredible insight. And I want to thank all of you for listening. Next week, we'll dive deeper into trust and connection, exploring why we feel more connected than ever, yet somehow more disconnected at the same time. Next week, we'll welcome Eric Termundi, best-selling author and keynote speaker on leadership, workplace culture, and talent management. Now, if you loved what you heard today and you want to go deeper, you'll find links in the show notes to pre-order Work for What's Next. And if these conversations spark ideas for how you can use them to engage your clients, whether that's bringing them into a showroom, or perhaps sharing them with your internal teams, or maybe even using them as a jumping off point for deeper dialogue. You can also visit the Think Lab website, linked in the show notes, and we've got lots of ways to extend the conversation through bulk orders of the book, live talks, or even workshops. Thanks for joining us. We're excited to share this entire season with you. Design Nerds Anonymous is a proud member of the Surround Podcast Network. Special thanks to our podcast production team, Rachel Senator and Rob Schulte.